Good afternoon. I'm Vali Nasr, the Dean of Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And on behalf of the Conflict Management Program and the I. William Zartman Field Trip Fund, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's discussion of what good is diplomacy, which is increasingly becoming a prevalent conversation in Washington. To address this question, we are privileged to host a conversation between two of our nation's most accomplished and skilled diplomats, Tony Blinken and Chester Crocker. Mr. Blinken's rich and vast experience makes him both a keen observer of the diplomatic landscape, but also a major mover in the last administration's diplomatic efforts, in particular on the Iran nuclear deal, which is now the focus of so much attention. I'm proud to say that after leaving Foggy Bottom, after busy years of work there, Mr. Blinken has agreed to join us here at Johns Hopkins SAIS as the Herter Nitze Distinguished Scholar at our Foreign Policy Institute. As the Obama administration's Deputy Secretary of State, he was the nation's #2 diplomat, leading diplomatic efforts in order to rebalance our relations with Asia, deal with the global refugee crisis, and fight against the Islamic State. Within the State Department, he created a full-time State Department presence in Silicon Valley and initiated State Department Innovation Forum, which engages in solving complex foreign policy problems. And before his tenure at State Department, Mr. Blinken served in the White House as assistant to the president and principal deputy national security advisor to President Obama, where he chaired the Interagency Deputies Committee, the administration's principal forum for formulating foreign policy. He also served as deputy assistant to the president and national security advisor to Vice President Joe Biden, as well as the Democratic staff director for the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. During the administration of President Bill Clinton, he was first a member of the White House National Security Council staff, and then a special assistant to the president and a senior director for European affairs. And in this role, he was the president's principal advisor for relations with the countries of Europe, the European Union, and NATO. Mr. Blinken began his government service at the State Department in 1993 as Special Assistant to the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs. He later was also responsible for overseeing foreign policy planning, communications, and speech writing as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Speech Writing and Strategy. And apart from his diplomatic career, Mr. Blinken practiced law and was a reporter for the New Republic magazine and has written for numerous publications, including the New York Times, the New York Times Magazine, and Foreign Affairs. He's a graduate of Harvard College and Columbia Law School, and most importantly, is married to a SAIS alumna. Our second guest, Dr. Chester Crocker, who will moderate the talk, likewise boasts a distinguished career in government and is particularly honored for his service as Assistant Secretary for Africa in the State Department. His diplomatic efforts led to Namibia's independence and the withdrawal of foreign forces from Namibia and Angola, and his service was duly noted when President Ronald Reagan granted him the President's Citizens Medal, the country's second highest civilian award. Professor Crocker is currently the James R. Schlesinger Professor in the Practice of Strategic Studies at Georgetown University, and perhaps more importantly, an engaged alumnus who received his doctorate from Johns Hopkins SAIS. Furthermore, Chester has yet another claim to fame. He is a major contributor to the Zartman Study Trip Fund. The fund aims to become an endowment that will enable our conflict management students to participate in studying, visiting, and writing about a contemporary conflict, an important tradition at SAIS that has contributed to conversations about conflicts and how to resolve them. This year's trip went to Nanjing and Beijing to study the South China Sea conflict and to Ukraine to study its current war. In next January, one group will be going to Israel and Palestine, while another will go to South Korea to get an up-close look at the possible brewing of U.S.-North Korea conflict. We are grateful to those who have contributed to the Zartman Fund already and hope many more will join that effort in the near future. Unfortunately, as you may have noted, one person is missing among us today, and that's Bill Zartman. I'm pleased to report that he's doing well. He's currently in France for a prior commitment and is still enjoying both his terrific teaching and his prolific publishing responsibilities. Along with Professor Daniel Server, he will lead the group to the Israel-Palestine in January. The Conflict Management Program, I. William Zartman Field Trip Fund, and I are immensely pleased to host today's conversation. Tony, the floor is yours, after which you'll join Chester in the conversation and turn eventually to questions from our distinguished audience. Please join me in welcoming our guests to the stage.
Well, good afternoon. Vali, thank you so very much, not just for today, but for your extraordinary leadership of this institution and the dynamism that you've brought to it, bringing together so many remarkable people. It's an honor and a privilege to be a small part of this. It's also a privilege to be here with Chester Crocker, one of the truly, truly great diplomats of our era. And diplomacy is not just a personal vocation, it's also a family vocation. Chet's daughter, Sheba Crocker, I had the great privilege of serving with at the State Department. She's carried on the family legacy and tradition remarkably well. Dan Sewer, wonderful to be with you as well, and thank you for the tremendous work that you're doing here. I do wish Bill Zartman were here, but clearly he's the most intelligent among us if he's in Paris and not in Washington. So I was asked to speak a little bit at the outset about a pretty simple subject. What good is diplomacy? And then I hope we'll have a conversation with all of you to get into some of that. But let me suggest a few things at the outset. These are clearly challenging times for American diplomacy. We are living and working in an environment that is more fluid and fraught with complexity than probably ever before. And this very complexity, combined with the almost relentless march forward of technology, has led some to question even the basic value of our diplomats, our embassies, our ambassadors. After all, capitals talk to each other in real time today. Social media gives virtually everyone a platform with near instantaneous communications. And this skepticism about the role and relevance and importance of diplomacy and diplomats seems, unfortunately, in my judgment, to be reflected in the current administration's apparent downgrading of diplomacy. Key jobs in the State Department remain unfilled 9 months into the administration. Entry-level hiring was frozen. The budget proposed by the White House and embraced by the Secretary of State includes a 30% cut for diplomacy, democracy, and development programs. This has led some to wonder if the age of diplomacy itself is over. Well, what I want to tell you today is I could not disagree more with that proposition and that conclusion. And I think it's important, especially now, to step back and just reflect for a few minutes on what American diplomacy and American diplomats have achieved in the very recent past. The fact is this: American diplomacy and the American leadership that it represents has produced powerful, positive results for the world and, I believe, for this country. Consider just for a minute some of the achievements of the second term of President Obama. American diplomacy gathered more than 65 countries in an anti-Daesh coalition to fight this extremist group and to fight violent extremism. And that coalition, backed by indigenous forces on the ground, has now liberated virtually all of Daesh's self-declared caliphate. That was a product of American diplomacy. American diplomacy mobilized the world to beat back Ebola and strengthen global health systems, building on President Bush's remarkable success in combating HIV/AIDS around the world through the PEPFAR program. American diplomacy played a decisive role in bringing together 195 countries in Paris to forge a historic climate agreement. American diplomacy helped revitalize NATO's commitment to the defense of its own members. It rallied European allies to stand against Russian aggression and to penalize Russia for its actions in Ukraine. American diplomacy deepened our strategic, economic, and diplomatic engagement throughout the Asia-Pacific region, giving substance to the so-called rebalance by bolstering our treaty allies, strengthening ties with emerging powers, supporting regional institutions, promoting trade and investment, enhancing our military posture, advancing democratic reforms, creating new networks of trilateral and multilateral cooperation. And of course, American diplomacy negotiated a cutting-edge trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that would have dramatically reduced barriers to U.S. products while raising at the same time standards for workers, for the environment, for intellectual property. American diplomacy carried our relationship with India to new heights, deepened coordination with Africa's most populous nation, Nigeria, and helped competing Afghan blocs achieve the first peaceful democratic transition of power in their history. American diplomacy convened the first ever U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit and helped build new relationships among the countries of Africa and the United States and with the private sector and NGOs. And American diplomacy reestablished diplomatic relations with Cuba. We welcomed the leader of Vietnam's Communist Party into the Oval Office before President Obama traveled to Vietnam, and we negotiated an agreement to prevent Iran from acquiring the material for a nuclear weapon, advancing the security of our partners and allies in the region, including Israel. In other words, through American diplomacy, we engaged and made important progress with three countries, Iran, Cuba, Vietnam, with whom we had long and, to say the least, complicated relationships. Now, I could keep going, but I think you get the point. And in each of these cases, and so many others I could talk about, I'd like to do a little thought experiment. And it's based on a movie that some of you may still watch just before Christmas. It's A Wonderful Life. For those of you who haven't seen this movie recently, it's about a man named George Bailey, who at the very start of the movie is standing on a bridge about to take his own life. He thinks he's been a failure to his family, to his town, to his community. And along comes an angel, taps him on the shoulder, and says, wait, before you do that, I want to show you what life would have looked like without you. And of course, the rest of the movie unfolds, and we see what his town, Bedford Falls, would have looked like without him in the picture. And while it's probably easier to prove a counterfactual in a Christmas movie, I think it's clear and fair to say where the world would be without American diplomacy, without American leadership, without American engagement. And for sure, we know where our own country would be. And for all of the deficiencies, for all of the mistakes, for all of the progress not made, if you take America out of the picture, it's a far, far darker one than when we are front and center. And looking forward, it seems clear to me that if we take American diplomacy out of the picture, we will have a disengaged, hunkered down, zero-sum country that will make every American worse off, and I believe many people around the world. That kind of America, a disengaged America, without our diplomats and our diplomacy on the front lines, would deny us the partnerships that we need around the world to confront challenges that are beyond the capacity of any one nation to resolve on its own, and that no wall, no matter how high, can possibly contain. Epidemics that defy frontiers, hackers who leap firewalls, terrorists that form global networks, aggressors who ignore borders, rogue actors that amass intercontinental arsenals, and an ocean that rises and a planet that warms. None of these challenges can be met without active engagement, and I believe none of them will be effectively met without American engagement. Relatedly, One of the things that I learned, and I suspect that Chet learned from so many years in doing this, is that, like it or not, the world is not self-organizing. If not us, then what? One of two things. Either other countries take that role, and they may lead in directions that are disadvantageous to us or not up to the standards that we'd like to set, or no one plays the role. And then you have a vacuum, and vacuums are often filled by the most malevolent forces. Going forward, as I think about it, we will need U.S. diplomatic leadership and global engagement if we want to preserve an open and connected world. Our workers and our companies will need U.S. global economic leadership to continue to level the playing field for our products and to help us reach the 95% of the world's consumers who happen to live outside the United States, hopefully setting high standards for workers, for the environment, for intellectual property. Our soldiers and our diplomats themselves will depend on the ability of those diplomats to help maintain an unrivaled network of alliances and partnerships to deter conflict in the first place, or, if necessary, to make us more effective when we have to fight. Our citizens will benefit from U.S. diplomacy and engagement in international institutions that, for all of their shortcomings, are laboring every day to help keep the peace, to prevent the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, to protect our environment, to defend human rights, to develop new norms and new realms, from cyberspace to outer space. And the fact of the matter is, again, for all their deficiencies, if these institutions, often shaped and animated by American leadership, didn't exist, well, we'd have to do it ourselves at higher cost, or it wouldn't get done at all. Peacekeeping around the world is much maligned through the UN system, and it has lots of reform needed. But think about it this way. There are about 100,000 peacekeepers wearing those blue hats or blue helmets. How many of them are American? About 70. So yes, we pay the largest share of that budget, but it's a pretty good deal for Americans. And if they weren't there, who would be? Would it be us, or would it be no one? And I think many of you know that for all of the criticism that it gets, the UN system, its agencies, are doing work every single day, again, often animated with American leadership, to feed millions, food to 90 million people in 73 countries, vaccinations for 58% of the world's children, saving 2.5 million lives every year, assistance to 36 million refugees last year, promoting maternal health, indeed, saving the lives of 30 million women around the world every year, and of course, advancing democracy through support for elections. It's also true that when we look at the assistance that we've provided to countries around the world over the years, another aspect of our diplomacy that's now being shortchanged, the development budgets, 6 out of our top 10 trading partners were at some point the recipients of U.S. foreign aid. I also believe that our communities and our businesses will continue to draw energy and vitality by the inclusion of new Americans through a secure and welcoming immigration system, and that too requires diplomacy to manage it effectively. Here, of course, we're engaged in a profound national debate. But I think about it this way. When I look at the entire spectrum of activities in this country, from the lowest end to the highest end, here's what I see. I see new arrivals to this country picking our crops, cleaning our rooms, making our food. I see them nursing our sick, doctoring underserved communities. And at the high end of the spectrum, I see them forming the companies that are the source of so much of our wealth going forward. 40% of Fortune 500 companies founded by immigrants or the sons and daughters of immigrants. 50% of Silicon Valley startups founded or co-founded by immigrants. 50% of companies valued over $1 billion founded or co-founded by immigrants. Parenthetically, Bret Stephens pointed this out very eloquently in a column a few months ago. New arrivals to the United States commit fewer crimes than those of us who've been here for a while. They tend to be more religiously observant. They're better educated. They have fewer out-of-wedlock births. And they're preventing our demographic demise by actually adding new citizens themselves over time. But there again, we need an engaged American diplomacy. to manage a safe and secure immigration system. And finally, I believe that going forward, our children will continue to find opportunity in America's continued global leadership in innovation, in science and technology. When I've traveled around the world and had the great privilege of doing that for the United States, one of the most powerful things that struck me was no matter how controversial a particular policy was, no matter how out of favor we might be for something we were doing, there continued to be almost everywhere I went an incredibly powerful attraction to education, to culture, to innovation, to technology in this country. And there too, being able to spread some of the benefits and make sure the world stays open and connected in a way that allows us to continue to advance innovation, science, and technology, that too is a role for diplomats. So, even in this time of tremendous global uncertainty and chaos, I actually came away from my own service in government and at the State Department more confident than ever in the power of American diplomacy to help navigate the turmoil, to guard against its risks, to take advantage of some of its opportunities. For me, the question is not really, at the end of the day, what good is diplomacy? Rather, it's how do we most effectively exercise it? By what means and to what ends? So let me end with just a few thoughts on that, some basic principles that I tried to set out and we tried to set out to think about how we exercise our diplomacy. First, I believe that diplomacy has to be grounded in a sense of purpose. And that purpose, in my judgment at least, is to ensure the security of our country, its citizens, our allies and partners, to promote a strong U.S. economy, to advance our values, and ultimately to shape an international order that helps bolster peace, security, and prosperity. Second, diplomacy will be more effective when we are leading from a position of strength, with unrivaled military might, with a dynamic economy, and with the unmatched strength of our human resources. Third, our diplomacy is always more effective when we lead by the power of our example as well as the example of our power, lifting our own citizens, growing our economy, and especially living our values here at home. Fourth, diplomacy works best when we are leading with capable partners, because at least in my experience, we can best advance our interests in an interconnected world when others are working with us, while recognizing at the same time that America and our own leadership is often necessary to bring others along. Fifth, diplomacy is especially effective when it is joined in a policy that uses all the instruments of American power, starting with diplomacy, but also, if necessary, an ever-ready military, our economic might, and the powerful attraction, as I said earlier, of innovation, of science, of technology, of culture. And finally, diplomacy that is grounded in a sense of perspective, that marries confidence with humility, strength with wisdom, is, in my experience, the most effective diplomacy. The fact of the matter is this: most of the world's problems are actually not about us in the United States, but they affect us and affect us profoundly. And again, in my own experience, more than any single country, we have an ability to mobilize others in the pursuit of collective solutions. Now, that's a tremendous responsibility, but it's also an opportunity to help shape a world that's just a little bit healthier, a little bit wealthier, a little bit wiser, and a little bit more secure than the one we started with. To those ends, American diplomacy, in my judgment, is more vital than ever. Thank you.
The conflict management program, represented here by a number of distinguished colleagues like Terry Hopman here and Dan Serwer, and I'm sure there are others whose names I'm missing. Bill, of course, Bill Zartman, is wisely in Paris. He's often in Paris. But when he's not in Paris, he's usually writing about 4 books at once, and they tend to be about conflict management and conflict resolution and mediation and things like that, negotiation. But he would be the first to say that diplomacy is at the core of this unit of the SAIS faculty. And it's a great thing that you're going to be part of the SAIS faculty, Tony, because you're going to add a lot to it. I've got a couple of opening questions based on your super overview of the importance of diplomacy. It seems to me that in the academy, there's been a tendency until fairly recently to not do so much diplomatic history as we used to do. That's going to change here at SAIS, I believe, under all the fantastic fundraising that's going on and the new positions. So that's very important. But it's only in recent years that you see in universities' course catalogs, you see a lot of references to American or European or global or Chinese or Arab diplomacy or whatever. It's only fairly recently that you see that. And so I think it's long overdue that we re-emphasize the importance of diplomatic history in our universities and in our teaching programs, our training programs. But my question to you to start this off is, why is diplomacy such an alien concept to the greater electorate, to the greater populace? Why do we have to explain all the things you so eloquently explained, which are, in a sense, kind of straightforward, and we should get it? Because you need diplomacy to do humanitarian relief, you need diplomacy to do war and peace, for all the different things that you outlined. How could you do it without some kind of diplomacy? But why is it so hard to get the point across in our media and in our maybe lower educational levels like high school and even middle school and grade school? The word diplomacy doesn't have the name it needs to have. I wonder if you could say a few words about that. Why do we have to rely on Jim Mattis to remind the American media that he'd need more ammunition? You know where I'm going here, so maybe you can take a whack at that.
Well, first, Chet, I think you're exactly right to put your finger in the first instance on the need to actually get back to some basics, including the study of diplomatic history.
Yes.
This is something that I think SAIS is particularly on the cutting edge of. I'm incredibly excited, among other things, many things, about the Kissinger Center that's taking shape, that's really grounded in the idea that we need to start with those basic principles. And doing grand strategy with a foundation in history is more important than it's ever been. In fact, you might say that those who forget history are condemned to retweet it. So I do think there's an urgency to it. Second, why this disregard for the diplomatic function? You know, I think it's part of a larger canvas that we're all operating in, and it's incredibly challenging. And when I looked out at what's dividing us more than anything, what strikes me is that it's not a division between left and right, Democrat, Republican, conservative, and liberal. It's increasingly a divide between those of us who, looking at the incredibly challenging changes that are going on all around us, think that the best answer is to play defense, to protect ourselves, to hunker down, and those of us who believe that we're better off trying to preserve an open, connected world and do what we can to shape these forces of change to our benefit, or at least to mitigate their downsides. And so you have, for so many of our fellow citizens, 3 things, I think, happening. And that, at least, this is a long way of answering the question. But I think it does explain, in part, why there's a tendency to disregard and to downplay the merits of diplomacy. First, with the sheer pace of technological change, the fact that we have an almost unbridled flow of information, as well as a sense of borders eroding around the world, that for many people creates a sense of chaos and confusion and vulnerability. And they're trying to figure out how to manage it. And in that context, it's not obvious to people that those of us we used to wear pinstripe suits are necessarily the most effective advocates for them. Second, we have this profound paradox where, in the aggregate, by virtually every measure, in the United States, and for that matter, in many countries around the world, we are better off. We are more secure. We're healthier, we're wealthier, we're wiser, we're even more tolerant than we were 50 or 60 or 70 years ago. But of course, that progress has not been evenly shared. And that, in turn, creates a sense of anger, fear, resentment. And there, too, it's not obvious to those who feel left out or left behind in all of this progress that all of this talk and diplomacy is the best way to advance their concerns. And finally, I think we've seen, and we've experienced this in our careers over the last 20 or 25 years, profound shifts in power, not just among countries, even with emerging countries coming onto the scene, but increasingly, in a sense, below them and beyond them, with newly empowered actors, the mayor of a megacity, a corporate chieftain, super empowered individuals and groups, all of whom now have a much greater ability than ever before, because they have technology, because they have the means of communication, to veto outcomes that traditional sources of power and responsibility, a national government, an international organization, normally wielded. And that makes it a lot harder for these traditional institutions to actually deliver for people. And that fuels a sense of a crisis of legitimacy and a crisis of confidence in traditional institutions, including those of us engaged in diplomacy. So I think in that environment, you're seeing emerge, again, an understandable attraction to simple solutions, nationalism, populism, that seem to offer a way forward and that don't usually rely on the kind of work that we do. They tend to disregard it. They think that we're the ones who have gotten the country into trouble. So that, to me, is the debate that we're engaged in. That's the larger canvas. There are other things going into it. I think people, of course, we see this in poll after poll after poll. The good news is, and I think the most recent study out of Chicago shows this, Americans continue overwhelmingly to believe in U.S. global engagement, leadership, diplomacy. But they also grossly overestimate how much money we actually spend on it. So that's another problem.
You know, if you ask Americans, do they believe in leadership and forward-leaning posture, you might get interesting poll results. If you ask them if they believe in diplomacy, you'd probably get a very negative reaction. And that's part of the problem that we're talking about, is that the word itself needs to be rebranded or properly branded, maybe. And that's going to be one of the things I hope you can accomplish while you're teaching here, because you know, for some years, there was no course in my university, which is, apart from Johns Hopkins, is Georgetown University. There was no course on European diplomatic history. I found that absolutely baffling, but they wouldn't use the term in the course title. But in fact, they were teaching it. They just didn't use the term. So I think we have a job of communication and a job of messaging here as well. I mean, how can you possibly do any of the things that you so eloquently outlined if you don't have a delivery mechanism or a transmission belt or whatever you want to call it? We have to figure out a better way to communicate this. So that's question one. Question two for you, and then I'm going to open this up a little bit because there's a lot of eager people here who have great questions for you, I'm sure. What would the Clinton administration, if there had been one, have done with North Korea?
Well, two things. First, I want to pick up one quick thread of your last question, because it really is important, because you're exactly right, that communicating this makes a huge difference. And I think part of the trap that those of us engaged in these pursuits often fall into is speaking in this kind of jargony, globo-technical speak that really doesn't relate to the way most people experience their lives. And one way to start, for example, whenever I got a memo or a speech draft that had something in it like multilateral fora, I crossed it out.
Get rid of it.
What, to most people, what does that mean? We talk a lot about the liberal international order. If I asked you to draw a picture of the liberal international order, what would it look like? You have to actually paint pictures in people's minds. And one of the things I think is very powerful, and this would in part answer the last question as well, is, facts and figures are important. Logic is important. 5-point plans are important. But if you're not touching people here, you're probably not going to have a lasting impact here. And in that sense, stories and narrative, to bring alive what diplomacy actually does, or what its absence might lead to, is probably more important than it's ever been. Quick example, and I suspect most of you remember this. In the midst of what is a truly historic migration and refugee crisis, a couple of years ago, there was a picture that went around the world. And it was a picture of that young Syrian child being carried ashore. He had drowned, being carried ashore by a Turkish soldier. And when that picture made its way around the world, the impact here in Washington in government was this. We were deluged with emails and calls and social media and people on TV saying, open the doors, let everyone in, bring every Syrian child to the United States. This can't happen in the 21st century. About 3 weeks later, there was a terrorist attack in San Bernardino, California, having nothing to do, by the way, with immigrants or refugees, but it was a terrorist attack, and that was where the finger immediately was pointed. And the pendulum swung dramatically in the opposite direction. No, build a wall, keep everyone out. These kinds of moments, images, stories, they have a profound impact. So for those of us who believe in diplomacy, who believe in global engagement with the United States, we have to find ways to tell the story, not just assert the logic. Now, North Korea.
We didn't rehearse this, by the way. I just popped that one on Tony, but I knew I could pop anything on you.
Well, we'll see about that. Look, I think North Korea, you have to start with a couple of premises. The first premise is that going back at least to the Clinton administration, arguably to the first Bush administration, successive American administrations have tried and not succeeded in arresting the forward progress of North Korea's nuclear program. Now, there was a period of about 6 years under the Clinton administration when something called the Agreed Framework was put in place. That was a negotiated agreement with North Korea that actually did freeze its plutonium-based program. And then for a variety of reasons, that agreement fell apart, and we can certainly get into that if anyone wants to. But other than that important moment, the progress has moved relentlessly forward, and it's accelerated over the last few years. And what's accelerated in particular, from the perspective of the United States, is an effort by North Korea to acquire the technology for an intercontinental ballistic missile with a miniaturized nuclear warhead that could actually reach this country. So I can tell you what we were doing at the end of the last administration and what I believe a Clinton administration would have continued to do, and actually, in all fairness, I think is basically what the Trump administration is doing if you can separate some of the bluster, which actually has a profoundly dangerous impact, which we can come to. Basically, it's this. We looked at this problem, and we looked at every possible way of answering it, because the idea that this technology would wind up in the hands of a leader who at best acts impulsively, some believe irrationally, I don't believe that, but at least someone that you don't have a lot of confidence going to bed at night thinking he would have this technology, what do you do about it? Well, we looked at military solutions. And the fact of the matter is we came to the conclusion that there is not a good military solution to the problem posed by North Korea's nuclear weapons program and missile program. Much of that program is buried deep underground in mountains. A bunch of it, we just don't know where it is. And so the idea that we could preemptively destroy the program really doesn't work. Even if we knew where everything was, and even if we could take a shot at it, as I think most of you know, North Korea has thousands of pieces of artillery and rockets poised about 25 miles from Seoul. It would almost certainly get off a retaliatory conventional salvo, decimating the capital of one of our closest allies, not to mention the many Americans who are there as well. So that doesn't look like a good option. And you hear some talk in the newspapers about cyber options, and of course, cyber in both directions with North Korea is very much in the papers. I think it's fair to say that most people probably have concluded that while cyber might be a means of delaying and disrupting the program, it's probably not a way to defeat it. So what are you left with? You're left with some kind of negotiation to see if you can arrest the forward progress of the program and ultimately roll it back, or you're left with accepting the proposition that North Korea develops this capacity, and then you learn to live with it. So we thought that we should make every possible effort at getting North Korea into some kind of effective negotiation. And there are two ways of doing that, and they have to be joined. On the one hand is pressure, and on the other hand is actual diplomacy and inducement. And the two have to come together. Pressure because, unlike his grandfather and father, in our estimate, Kim Jong-un sees the nuclear program and the missile program as his ultimate insurance policy for survival. The grandfather and father I think, saw them more as negotiating and bargaining tools, and they were prepared to engage those programs in a negotiation, see if they could get something. Kim Jong-un, I think, for not crazy reasons, sees it as his only insurance policy against regime change. So the price, the pressure, the cost on him has to be extraordinarily high if he's going to put that into play. Very quickly, I think there are ways to exert meaningful pressure on North Korea that we haven't done effectively or systematically or in a sustained way. But basically working to deny it the resources that it needs to continue to fund these programs and to buy off elites. China is key to this. 90% of North Korea's trade is to, through, or with China. If China turns the screws, that can have an effect. The other thing that we did and started to work on, and the administration has picked this up, is around the world, North Korea has economic, diplomatic, political, military relationships with countries on virtually every continent. The economic piece is not insignificant. There are tens of thousands of North Korean guest workers working in countries around the world. They send their earnings, their remittances back home, but not to their families. They are forced to send it to the government. That goes to pay for the missile program, for the nuclear program. By some estimates, it's about $1 billion a year. We were going around systematically with South Korea, with Japan, trying to cut that off, trying to cut off so-called diplomats who are actually engaged in illicit commercial enterprises, sending tens of millions of dollars back home a year, again, for the military program. So you've got to bring all that together. But if you can't also show that there is a diplomatic light at the end of the tunnel, that is, if North Korea is prepared to engage, there is something in it for North Korea, then I don't think that all the pressure in the world is going to get you there. And that's something that this administration has yet to articulate. It's also necessary, I think, to convince the Chinese that at the end of the day, if they're willing to exert truly meaningful pressure on North Korea and so risk real instability on the peninsula, including millions of refugees going north, and especially the possibility of losing their strategic buffer with South Korea and the United States, they have to have greater confidence that that picture at the end of the day actually keeps their interests intact. For example, that there wouldn't be, say, American troops right up on the Chinese border. All of that has to be marshaled. But in the absence of that, the alternative is learn to live with it. And that means building up your defenses, building up your deterrence to make it very, very clear to North Korea that if it ever used a nuclear weapon, it would be annihilated. So that's where we are. I'm afraid that this is a subject for maybe something, another conversation, but the bluster that we've heard coming from, unfortunately, from the president, I think has only made this proposition as challenging as it already is, vastly more complicated and more dangerous.
Well, thank you very much. I think we probably should open this up. I'll jump in from time to time if I want follow-ups and to give us a sense of diverse focus. So the floor is open. Who would like to throw a question to our guest?
Curveballs, fastballs, spitballs.
Well, right in the front row, Terry Hopman. Oh, you ought to get the first question, then I'm coming to you.
I was meeting with the students in Korea in January from SAIS. But I'm interested also, I've studied nuclear arms disarmament negotiations for the last 45 years or so, but the Iran negotiation obviously sets some precedents also for any possible negotiations with Korea, and a lot of people have talked about, of course, what will happen in terms of our credibility vis-a-vis anyone we're negotiating with in Beijing or Pyongyang or wherever, if in fact the United States pulls back from the Iran negotiations. I wonder if you could comment on, first of all, your experience in the Iran negotiations and what you think we need to do in terms of not setting dangerous precedents that will also make life even more difficult with the negotiations with Korea.
Thank you very much. And, it really is the perfect example because, and it's very, I think, appropriate to the conversation today. The Iran agreement was the product of years and years and years of painstaking diplomacy. And it started with a strong foundation of sanctions and pressure that was laid here in the United States. But that had its limitations. And it was only when we were able to use that foundation to build upon it an international coalition to try to pressure Iran to come to the table that we had some success. And that took 2 to 3 years of painstaking diplomacy, actually by the Obama administration. And there was an implicit deal in this. And the deal was we got other countries around the world, starting with our European partners, and there's some history here which is worth recalling in a minute, but also Russia, China, India, Japan, countries around the world that had economic relationships, especially countries that were buying oil from Iran, to agree that Iran's pursuit of a nuclear weapons capacity, and in this case particularly, putting in place an infrastructure that could develop fissile material for a nuclear weapon on very short order, that was something that was against the interests of all of these countries, and that they needed to join us in doing something about it. But that never would have worked, and these countries never would have signed on to actually exerting that pressure if we hadn't equally made clear that our goal was not to bring Iran to its knees, but simply to bring it to the table to negotiate some kind of resolution to this problem, that there was a diplomatic end goal to that. That was why we were able to get these countries to sign on. And ultimately, over time, the pressure that was exerted, particularly denying Iran about $150 billion in resources, mostly from the sale of oil, the proceeds of which were frozen in bank accounts around the world by other countries who bought into this. That, combined with the election of President Rouhani, who wanted to re-engage Iran in the world, that created the environment in which we actually could get into a negotiation. But that negotiation had to start also with a certain degree, as adversarial as we are, and as much as we abhor so many of Iran's activities around the world, with also a basic sense of respect. Iran had invested over the years about $100 billion in its nuclear program and its national pride. The idea that we were going to simply eliminate that program through a negotiation was and remains an absolute fantasy. Parenthetically, when we had negotiating positions in the past with Iran that involved, for example, them having 0 centrifuges, that went nowhere. For example, in 2003, the position of our administration at the time, when Iran at that point had 150 centrifuges spinning, was that they could have 0. By the time we got the problem, they had almost 19,000. So that was not a very effective negotiating position, despite the fact that we had made them part of the axis of evil. We had more than 100,000 troops in Iraq, and we were ratcheting up our own national pressure. Similarly, in 2008, when the Bush administration was looking at this, their position was that Iran could have 0 enrichment capacity. And that proved to be a total non-starter. And of course, by the time we inherited the problem, they were on the threshold of being a breakout state, that is, having the capacity in a matter of months and ultimately in a matter of weeks to get fissile material for a nuclear weapon. So, you know, you can't make the perfect the enemy of the good. Ultimately, in understanding the art of the possible, we were able to reach, as you know, an interim agreement that more or less froze the program in place, even started to roll back pieces of it, got inspectors on the ground, and that bought us time and space to see if we could negotiate a more comprehensive agreement, which we did. And in many ways, that could have been some kind of model for North Korea. Now, in fairness, there's a big difference. That is, the status quo in Iran was that it did not have nuclear weapons or the ability to rapidly make the fissile material, even though that's exactly where it was heading. North Korea, unfortunately, has a fairly significant arsenal. So there is a difference. But there is something there. I could not agree more, though, with what you said at the outset of the question, which is that if we arbitrarily throw out the Iran agreement, because keep in mind, by every account, Iran, again, for all of its other activities in other parts of the world that we don't like in its own region, at least when it comes to the nuclear agreement, it is making good on its obligations. The International Atomic Energy Agency has certified 8 times that Iran is making good. The Trump administration itself certified twice until this week that it was making good. Our intelligence agencies know that it is making good. Our partners know. So exactly as you said, if we throw out an agreement that the other party is adhering to, the already small chance we have of getting an agreement with North Korea on its program goes from very small to probably close to 0. Because why in the world would Kim Jong-un strike a deal with a country that simply tears it up if it feels like it? And beyond North Korea, our ability anywhere, anytime, to strike an agreement, I think, is significantly diminished. America's word, the full faith and credit of America's word, has been significantly weakened. So I think this would have profound ramifications beyond even Iran. It's basically up to Congress right now, because the president, in decertifying, triggered a provision in the law that says Congress now has 60 days in order to determine whether to reimpose sanctions on Iran and, in effect, kill the deal. My hope is that Congress does not take that step.
Even if Congress did take that step, in the P4+1 salvage the JCPOA? That's a follow-on question, it seems to me, because everyone in Europe is saying, hey, it's not your American deal, it's our deal.
It's exactly, I think, Chet, that's exactly right. And that's another thing that got lost in all of this, is that this was not an agreement between the United States and Iran. It was an agreement between, in effect, the international community in Iran and certainly some of its leading members. The short answer is yes, but here's one of two things will happen if Congress actually reimposes sanctions and, in effect, craters the deal. Iran will be able to decide, in effect, whether to consider itself no longer bound by the constraints on its nuclear program, on its enrichment capacity in the deal, in which case it will resume the activities that led us to need to get this deal in the first place, getting itself moving ever closer to becoming a breakout state, having the capacity within a matter of weeks of getting enough fissile material for a nuclear weapon. And then we'll be right back where we started, which is needing to confront that possibility. And there you'll see, you know, the opponents of the agreement always hated it when we said, well, their path leads us to war. They thought that was totally demagogic and disingenuous. But the fact is, it probably leads to some kind of use of military force. Whether that turns into a war, I don't know. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is exactly the one you said, Chet, which is this. The other parties to the agreement say, no, it's still in effect, it's still in force. Iran decides to continue to abide by the constraints in the agreement and so continue to enjoy the benefits of the agreement in terms of being able to do trade with other countries, to sell its oil, to get the proceeds. And then we're faced with a really hard choice. Because if we're trying to put the squeeze on Iran and our partners are continuing to do business with it, then we have to decide whether to actually pressure them, not Iran, to stop this business with secondary sanctions. We've been down this road before. In 1996,
Yeah.
you probably remember this, Congress tried to force the administration at the time to get our closest partners in Europe to not invest in Iran's energy sector. And they passed secondary sanctions. Well, the reaction from Europe was not, oh, sorry, we won't do that anymore. It was the European Union passing blocking legislation that made it a crime for companies within the Union to actually meet the sanctions that we put in place. And they started to take us to the World Trade Organization, so we stood back. I would predict something like that would happen again.
Okay, yes, sir. The blue shirt right here.
Thank you, gentlemen. And I actually would like to hear thoughts from you both on the question I'm about to ask, if you would like to share them. I want to ask sort of a zoomed out version of Professor Hopman's question, sort of about the credibility of American diplomacy, but even just the capacity of American diplomacy going forward. I'm sure you all and many in this room have read many pieces in various publications about the unique within the federal government, some might say decimation of American diplomatic capacity under this administration and under this Secretary of State. And cabinet secretaries come and go. You know, it could be a week from now and we may have a whole new department, but it seems, from my perspective anyway, that there has been considerable damage done to the capacity of American diplomacy, and I'm wondering just how permanent could that, or irreparable could that damage be, and what needs to be done going forward if there is a change, if there isn't a change, to rectify that.
So for me to start?
Yeah.
So I share the concern that you raised, and I share it particularly because I spent the last 2 years at the State Department before the end of the administration, and I'd started my career at the department, ended my career at the department, and throughout my career, worked pretty much every single day with Foreign Service officers, civil servants, others, and developed a profound respect, admiration, appreciation for folks who dedicate their lives to trying to advance our interests around the world through diplomacy. And what I've seen is two things over the last 9 months. One, as I alluded to, most of the senior level appointed positions, so-called political appointments in the department, have not been made. And I believe to date, and I may be out of date by a couple of weeks, but at least as of a couple of weeks ago, not a single undersecretary or assistant secretary had been confirmed, newly confirmed, as a political appointee. Now, there's several who are in the pipeline, and maybe there have been a couple who have been confirmed the last week or two. I haven't checked. But this was extraordinary. In fact, the only person confirmed was actually a terrific person, the guy who succeeded me as deputy secretary, a guy named John Sullivan, who's doing a wonderful job and has a real reverence for the department. And I probably shouldn't say that because I'll get him in trouble. So on the one hand, and there are reasons for this. First, people who had signed Never Trump letters were basically eliminated from consideration. And as it happened, they were many of the most qualified, competent people on that side of the aisle. Others who hadn't signed the letter, who were solicited for jobs, said they didn't want to do it. And then I think the White House had a particularly heavy hand on looking at political appointments. That slowed the process. But there's also something else going on, and that is Secretary Tillerson has been fixated on a so-called reorganization of the department. And part of the logic has been, well, you know, until we figure out this reorganization and what the department's going to look like, we probably shouldn't be making appointments to these jobs because maybe some of these jobs will be eliminated. And now, there's a certain surface logic to that, except when you think about it for 2 seconds, it's not. I think under any conceivable reorganization, there is going to be an Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, for Africa, for Latin America, for Asia. And even if the administration didn't want one, Congress wouldn't allow them to be eliminated. So why there's been this delay, I think, is hard to fathom. So that's one side. But then you have another side, and that is these career Foreign Service officers and civil servants who could have been called upon to fill the vacuum in a meaningful way in the absence of confirmed political appointees. And here is where I think the administration's made a profound mistake. And that is that it seems to have viewed Foreign Service officers and civil servants as the enemy, as representatives of the deep state who are out to somehow undermine the agenda of the administration of the president and the secretary. Chad, I'll turn to you in a minute, but here's my experience. My experience over 25 years is that 9 times out of 10, I could not tell you the political beliefs or affiliation of Foreign Service officers and civil servants that I worked with. What I could tell you is that all of them, to a man and woman that I can think of and that I worked with, wanted whoever they were working for, the secretary, whoever he or she was, to succeed, and wanted their administration to succeed. And when the secretary's voice was heard, well, that's how their voice was heard. So the idea that these people would become enemies and adversaries, and so marginalized from the policy process, I think it's profoundly misguided. And it's also penalized the department in a profound way, and the secretary in a profound way. When you go to the Situation Room in the White House, representing the State Department, to try to decide what policy should be, you need to bring with you intellectual capital, people who know the issues, who have experience in them, who are grounded in them, to give you recommendations, to give you ideas, to give you advice. Because no matter how smart you are, you're not enough. And that intellectual capital has been denied this secretary, I think, by his own hand. Second, once the policy is decided and it's time to implement it, you kind of need assistant secretaries and deputy assistant secretaries, the people who are actually the most important jobs of the State Department, the assistant secretaries of state and their deputies. That is where the diplomacy actually gets done.
Remember those words.
This is no lie. So that's been denied. So here's my conclusion, and this is the last thing I'd say on this. What's really, really disturbed me profoundly is I cannot begin to tell you the number of people that I've had conversations with over the last 9 or 10 months, career officers who said, I'm going to leave, or I'm thinking of leaving. And I've tried to dissuade them from doing that because it seems to me profoundly unjust that someone who's made a huge investment, 10 years, 12 years, 15 years in their career, suddenly feels obligated because they're marginalized to leave. But some of them are, more of them will, and the result will be not just a penalty now, but to your question precisely, these are the folks who in 10 years, or 12 years or 15 years, will be the assistant secretaries, the senior leadership of the department. We are at risk of losing some of the most talented people, and that impact will be felt a decade from now, not just today. I know, Chet, what's your experience?
Yeah, I would add that, of course, some of those senior career people are being pushed Some of them are leaving because they're disgusted or they're marginalized or they're given a job that's not relevant to their qualifications. Some of them are being pushed. Somebody I'm sure you know well, John Heffern, is a good example of
Great
that.
example, yeah.
Former head of the European Bureau, who traveled all over the place with Rex Tillerson, actually, but did one little thing that got somebody's knickers in trouble, and he was asked to leave on very, very short notice. That's a huge loss. So it's both a question of people being demoralized and people being pushed. I guess the next point I would make is that part of the problem in terms of getting appointments made, there's a lot of acting assistant secretaries and others. Part of the problem is not within state, it's over in the White House personnel operation, which typically in the past has had somebody running it, and then you'd have representatives of other departments and offices, but they could make decisions. At the present time, that office operates on a unit veto principle, which means that anybody can veto a name. And so names get vetoed and they don't go forward. And of course, Tillerson's had that problem. So there's that factor. I recall the transition between Ronald Reagan and Bush 41, who got more done in 3.5 years than most presidents get done in 2 terms. But when they first came in, even though it was the same political party, and I was staying on for another 6 or 8 months or whatever, one of Jim Baker's top aides, an undersecretary, came to me and said, Chet, we hear that something about your reputation. I said, oh, Ivan Selin, this was. Ivan, what is it about my reputation? He said, we hear that you can get along with Foreign Service officers. What's your secret? And I tried to point out that, well, you could take one to lunch. There's different things, different things you could do. But Tony's exactly right. In my view, the Foreign Service is not all people who are prepared to fall on their sword. They want to see success. If they see the possibility of success, they will support it without reference to partisanship. And I never knew what parties what party my people were working for, and I didn't care. What I cared was, were they competent? I mean, you know, and the fantastic people. So, yeah, this is a real loss. And especially, I just to reiterate the point about senior leaders and up-and-coming senior leaders, we don't want to see a whole generation or two kind of decapitated, to say nothing of castrated. But I'm told that castration's not a problem, that the senior leader, the top leader, is intact, and that we don't have to have any further worries on that score. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Oh, trouble. Ed?
Not at all. Tony, already a great conversation here, and that was an impressive list of accomplishments that you played a key role in at the outset. If you would permit me, and Ambassador Crocker here, I would like to ask you 2 questions, a broad one on the subject of diplomacy and a specific one, a conflict management question, and I should say I have the privilege of co-teaching in conflict management here with Dan Serwer. The broad question is, Tony, we're all focused, of course, understandably on the Trump spectacle, but would you agree that in fact, this question of diplomacy, if we mean it in terms of America's role in the world, and chiefly, is America indispensable in that? Doesn't it really predate Trump? And didn't we, even under the Obama administration, this came up, we had the question of leading from behind. It came up in the administration and in academia. You had guys like Fareed Zakaria writing, hey, we don't need to worry so much about a world in which America is no longer the preeminent leader. India and these other countries, it'll be okay. So there was already a debate going on about that, and foreign policy begins at home. So I wanted to just get your perspective so that it's not just, oh, Trump, and we get a little bit off course there. The specific question, conflict management question I want to ask you about is Libya. And Ambassador Crocker asked you about North Korea. I wanted to ask you, Tony, what do you make, you mentioned in your answer that Kim Jong-un's approach to nuclear weapons is different from his father and his grandfather. And one of the arguments is why it's different is Gaddafi. So I wanted to get your reaction to that, and if you permit me a real conflict management question, the intervention. Given that it was the British and French who were coming to us, as they were demandeurs, as diplomats like to say, why, or perhaps the administration, some argued this, why not say to the British and French, look, we've seen this movie before. We've seen in Iraq what happens when you decapitate a Middle East dictatorship. Chaos ensues. So you want us to come in here, how many police trainers, how many post-conflict, how much investment are you willing to make to ensure that this doesn't go the way of Iraq? Thank you.
Was that a question?
Great. No, great.
Good.
And
Okay.
both
Okay.
great points, and I think great questions. I'll try to be brief, but just quickly on the first. You're 110% right. This is a debate and a tension that has certainly preceded this administration. And look, I think back at the time when we first worked together in the 1990s, during the Balkan era as well, there was a huge debate about whether we should be engaged at all. And in fact, tremendous criticism of the United States for being very late to the party. Of course, ultimately, we had the work of a truly extraordinary diplomat for all of his unique ways of pursuing diplomacy, Dick Holbrooke, that made a huge difference. And ultimately, the United States, though, did make the difference, and I think it proved the point when it came to Bosnia. It was really not until we engaged in a meaningful way, actually marrying strength and diplomacy, that we were able to move things to a better place. And arguably, you can make the same point about Kosovo. It took us a little less time to get off the dime with regard to Kosovo. But yes, that was the debate. I do think that if you look at many of the challenges that we face, particularly when it comes to conflict management, and particularly when it comes to a conflict that, two things, and this is what you all are working on. We all know that an ounce of prevention beats a pound of cure, but this is where diplomacy is more critical than it's ever been, because if we're not able to mobilize those resources ahead of time, we're going to end up with conflict itself, and it's a heck of a lot harder to do. And it's a heck of a lot harder to bring people along into some kind of meaningful engagement to end a conflict, as tough as it is to get them to give us the resources that we need to try to prevent them. But yes, this debate's been going on, and I think it goes back to your first question, which is we've done a lousy job somehow in sort of selling this proposition to our fellow citizens. But then this also goes back to deep strains in our own national psychology.
That's exactly right. I mean, is diplomacy a contact sport, or is it actually something where if you engage with another party, the party might actually say yes, and then will you take yes for an answer? I mean, so
exactly.
Real men don't negotiate, right? I mean, so
this is a real tension that I think actually. By the way, you were talking about the diplomacy being a much maligned word. I think that also happens to be the title of a truly extraordinary volume that Henry Kissinger wrote that traces the history of American and European diplomacy in incredibly effective ways, which I would commend to anyone. Libya, very quickly. To me, this is personally, along with Syria, probably the two biggest sources of regret and frustration that I have from my time in this last administration. As someone who is an advocate internally for intervening, because at the time we saw Gaddafi heading toward, inexorably, slaughtering a lot of his own people. And we thought we had an almost unique situation where the Security Council was united, at least briefly. All of the outside partners, including the Europeans that you referenced, willing to play a leadership role. All of the neighbors saying something needs to be done. And we kind of thought this was a unique circumstance where everything was lined up, suggesting we should work to stop him. I think we didn't go in intending to decapitate the regime, but one thing led to another, and we did. And then we clearly, and this will haunt me, we were not ready for what followed. I will say this, though. It wasn't simply that the Europeans were not prepared to do enough and to really engage, particularly on the security side. One thing we just didn't anticipate when it came to Libya was the visceral resistance of Libyans to any outside engagement and intervention. So one of the most frustrating experiences I had was spending the better part of a year trying to help convince the Libyan government that came after Gaddafi to simply sign off on trainers having their forces trained by the United States, by Europeans, others. They wouldn't do it. And we didn't want to impose it on it. We also actually did talk about an international peacekeeping force to provide security. They were violently opposed to that. So I think we didn't fully understand the sort of profound psychology of not wanting any foreigners on their soil. The other thing I think we misunderstood or didn't give enough sort of focus on was that Gaddafi had done a brilliant job of making sure that there was no competent state administration or administrators throughout the system. So it was very hard to find anyone to work with. Now, arguably, we should have kind of known that ahead of time. We didn't, and we tried to do it on the fly, and it didn't work.
I think in the interest of time, I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions now for you, Tony.
Sure.
So, yes, in the back with the blonde hair. Pardon my identification.
Oh, by the way, and I should have said this at the outset, you know, if you would, tell us who you are, if you're here, what you're studying. Should have done that at the outset.
Great. My name is Sarah Hudson. I'm a second-year student here. And I want to kind of build off of the previous question about kind of the future of diplomacy. A lot of us here are considering, you know, something very personal, our jobs, and the future. And what are your recommendations for young people right now who are interested in serving their country in capacity to working in diplomacy, making a difference, but are, speaking personally, kind of concerned for joining what seems to be a sinking ship where people are leaving in droves? Should we delay? Should we wait it out? Is it still something that we should pursue?
Okay. Yes, in the front row, there's a question. You've been very patient, and then another question here, and then Rick. Rick.
Tony, I'm Caitlin Antrim. I've been working on Law of the Sea forever. And over the past 10 years, as the country's become driven more by a populist sentiment, informed by groups that have great rapport with the people in the inland states, we find it harder and harder to get people to support really complex decision-making. You had some of that bollocks up some of your efforts and the administration efforts. Have you had some time to give some thought to how to deal with that, how to build a more supportive populace outside of the coastal states to go to the heartland and get some support for diplomacy?
Great question.
Hi, I'm Tova Norland, and I'm at the Elliott School. I wanted to go back to your talk a little bit and also go a little bit global and perhaps back to the concepts. You mentioned that the American public is skeptical of diplomacy, and you associated it with American power, leadership, all those words and concepts that we often hear. Now, if we took that across the pond, that would not be how they would define diplomacy as they see it, as they study it. You mentioned the contrafactuals, and you also mentioned Clinton and Bosnia, which is a good example of the contrafactual. But in all truth, no American diplomacy obviously is not no diplomacy. So is there something, having said that, that we can learn from the diplomacy of our partners where we can be more humble, where we can correct ourselves, perhaps more on a conceptual level, although I really, really enjoy all the amazing details that you are sharing, but on a more conceptual level, conceptual level.
Okay, one more over here, Rick.
Yeah, hi, I'm Rick Ehrenreich, SAIS grad, PhD, long time ago. You were talking about the United States as the indispensable nation, and also talking about how to deal with the North Korea issue. And it seems to me that the indispensable nation there is China. And if China is the indispensable nation, what does China get? How does this thing play out? I mean, it does seem that they do have the ability to some degree to change things. But it also seems that they would want something and quite a lot in return. And it would lead us, I think, again to perhaps a diplomatic deal that leads to somebody saying it's the worst deal of all time, and a lot of public
Embarrassment.
skepticism about the role of diplomacy.
So there's 4 questions. You want
All
to
right.
take those?
Yeah, let me do them in reverse order. Let me start with the last one, which is an excellent question. In short, I think with regard to China, there's what it gets and what it doesn't get, which is part of the equation. Here's what President Obama said to President Xi Jinping when he was engaging him on the growing, deepening concern that we had about North Korea developing an ICBM capacity with a nuclear weapon. He said to Xi Jinping, look, this is now a core interest of the United States. You talk about your core interests in Tibet, Taiwan. This is becoming a core interest for the United States. And it is really a problem for us to abide the notion that this leader in this country will have that capacity. We want to work with you to deal with it cooperatively. That's our strong preference. But if you can't or won't join us in trying to exert meaningful pressure on North Korea to get it to the table, to negotiate, there are things we're going to have to do to protect ourselves and protect our partners and allies that are not aimed at you, China, but you're not going to like. Missile defense, more of that. We saw China's reaction to the deployment of the THAAD system in South Korea. We said to them, look, you don't like that, but if this continues, there's going to be son of THAAD, too. A greater, not lesser, U.S. presence in terms of our maritime presence, our exercises with the Japanese, with the Koreans. There's going to have to be more of that because we're going to have to more effectively defend ourselves and deter the DPRK. And, you know, ultimately there may have to be sanctions on any person or business, whatever their nationality, that is doing business that props up the military in North Korea. So it's in short, part of what China would not get if it did more were some of the things that it really doesn't like, which I just went through. But there's a flip side, and I alluded to this, and I think this is vitally important. It's very, very, very understandable from China's perspective that it does not want to risk chaos on the Korean Peninsula and ultimately some kind of crisis that leads ultimately to reunification of the peninsula. But certainly in the short term, a crisis that leads to millions of refugees and then ultimately into losing that strategic buffer that it has. And that's where I think it's really urgent and critical that we figure out a way to engage the Chinese in a conversation that we've been unable to engage them in meaningfully on what are the futures of the peninsula and how do we all think about how our interests are protected, including China's interests. So we've tried to do that, and China has not been enthusiastic about engaging. But I think we're really at a point where even if it means talking at them for a while until they're willing to talk with us, we need to do that. And so I think China does need some comfort that at the end of the day, if Kim is deposed tomorrow, or if there's a conflict that leads to reunification or some other kind of crisis, that it can have some confidence that its most basic interests, again, particularly not having Americans up at the border, how the nuclear sites are dealt with, what the governance is, that needs to be addressed. Otherwise, we're not going to get there. So it's a combination of China, I think, increasingly sees Kim Jong-un as the problem, not the United States, even though it continues to say we're the ones who have the responsibility for dealing with this. But there is no love lost, as you know, between Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un. And I think increasingly it sees North Korea itself as the source of the instability it fears. But it's tried to stay on the fence and have it both ways. And at some point you can't. And our job is to, through both a little bit of pressure, but also some inducement, get it to get off the fence. And I think that's not impossible. It's just very hard. Can we learn from the diplomacy of our partners? Yes, absolutely, 110%. I've probably learned more from watching partners in action from every part of the world, both from countries, also from international organizations, doing the painstaking day in, day out work of diplomacy. I've learned more from them than from anyone. And I've seen extraordinary career diplomats who don't get the recognition or the rewards. But, you know, at the end of the day, I think there's a common denominator in diplomacy, whether it's American or whether it's French, or whether it's the UN or anything else. And the common denominator is showing up. If you're not there, day in, day out, if you're not building the relationships, if you're not having the conversations, you're probably not going to get very far. And that just requires a lot of sustained effort. And I think the best diplomats are the ones who build these relationships. And again, I've seen that in action more times than I can count. And then finally, I would say it's something that Chet started off with. I think that our partners around the world tend to have a much more acute sense of history than we do. And as a result, they sometimes have a better understanding of what the motivations are of different actors. We tend to see things, we tend to be always forward-looking and problem-solving. Many of our partners in diplomacy actually do spend some time looking backward to understand, how did we get to this point? And I would say we don't do enough of that, and they maybe don't do quite enough of the forward-looking problem-solving. If you put the two things together, it can be pretty effective. How do we build more support among the populace? And Law of the Sea actually is a great example, another huge frustration. We tried like the devil, as you know, to get that through the Senate for many years. I thought we were actually making progress when we got the most powerful advocates possible for it, the military, the U.S. military coming up and testifying why it was actually in the interest of the country. But even that didn't do it. I also thought when we started to see our friends in China using a lot of interesting arguments to justify expanding their reach in the South China Sea and other places. And we said, boy, we're in this ironic situation where we've not signed on to Law of the Sea, but we're actually abiding by its rules. China has signed on, but it's ignoring them. We would have been on stronger ground if we were part of it. But much more broadly, I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. I would like to see our diplomats, our soldiers, our business people spend a lot more time when they come home going back to their communities and talking to people in credible local voices about how they've benefited, how they've gained from having an open, connected world, and in which other countries, other companies, other individuals have partnered with them to solve problems. And again, bring it down to a very concrete level. When it's talked at you from the coasts, those voices don't resonate. My voice doesn't resonate. Others don't resonate. You need credible local voices to make this case. And there are a lot of people who are actually working on that now. So that's one part of it. Second part, as I said earlier, I think is telling stories. You've got to reach people here in different ways. And I think there are ways to do that effectively. And then third, as I said, again, we talk in abstract principles that don't really connect with what people are experiencing in their own lives. I think there are ways to be more effective in doing that. But it's a massive, massive effort. I will say this, I still am sort of strangely optimistic about this because I found more times than not when I'm traveling around our own country here that most of our fellow citizens are pretty logical and commonsensical. And when you actually sit down and have a conversation, they get it. And when they have a problem, there's usually a good reason that they have a problem. And if we're not addressing the problem, if we're not addressing the fact that too many people feel left out or left behind in this forward march of progress, then the legitimacy of everything is in doubt. To me, this moment is, in many ways, a little bit like the time just before the progressive era, when capitalism had been fully unleashed, but there were not real checks and balances. And yeah, there was tremendous progress and tremendous wealth being created, but it wasn't being very evenly distributed. Too many people were suffering the rough edges of capitalism, and the entire system was actually in jeopardy. The legitimacy of the system in jeopardy, and it took a progressive era and later a New Deal to actually, I think, save capitalism from itself. I think we're at that kind of moment. Final thing. Should you join the Foreign Service? Yes. If they'll have you, that is, if they're taking anyone. Look, administrations come and go, leadership changes, but the institution itself, its importance, its relevance, its centrality, I think, doesn't go away, even if at a particular time it may be a little bit marginalized or not where it should be. So if you're attracted to that kind of life, which is, to me, extraordinarily rich in being exposed to every conceivable culture and issue and question and challenge, and to having the opportunity to actually advance the interests and the well-being of your fellow citizens, you don't get those opportunities very often. You get them in different ways, but certainly in my own experience, I haven't found one as satisfying as working for the government. And that's a way of serving, of contributing that, you know, there are different ways of doing it, but I didn't find anything as satisfying. So I would say, even with all the frustrations and even with the current moment that we're living, it's still really worth it. And I still think that you'll find a lot of foreign service officers and civil servants who are getting a tremendous amount out of it. But I would be the first to admit that what I just said was tremendously self-serving, because from my perspective, if we can't encourage the most talented people in your generation to sign up, serve the country, be a foreign service officer or civil servant, then we are really approaching the future with two hands tied behind our backs. And I really worry that the best and the brightest and most talented are, for a variety of reasons, not going to go into that pursuit. So it's in my own interest to tell you, yeah, do it, because we really, really need you. So I hope you'll consider it.
I'd say amen to that. I think one data point to throw in on that very subject is that the acceptance rates at Georgetown are up.
Is that right?
Yeah. Now, why would that be? I don't mean acceptance into the Foreign Service. I mean acceptance into graduate school at Georgetown. They're up. Why? Because I think a lot of young people have decided, you know, this era will pass. There might be life after this era. And maybe the Foreign Service will reconstitute itself. Anyway, that's a way of underscoring the hopeful theme on which Tony concluded. Please join me in thanking Tony for his fine remarks.
Great to be with you. Thank you.